I stood at the base of my own stairs, gripping the banister to keep my balance as my daughter-in-law laughed from the head of the table, my table. Her voice rang out sharp and clear. "Careful, Margaret. You'll need the calories for your coffin." My son chuckled weakly beside her, eyes fixed on his plate like the food might swallow him whole. No one defended me. Not after the dinners, the mortgage, the decades of quiet sacrifice. I wasn't their mother, not anymore. I was the unpaid help. And suddenly, my house didn't feel like mine. It felt like the scene of a slow betrayal. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The dining room smelled of bubbling tomato sauce and baked cheese. The lasagna steam still curling up from the pan Margaret had pulled from the oven minutes earlier. It was her specialty, the dish she had made for Ethan's birthdays, for school fundraisers, for Sunday dinners when her husband was still alive. Tonight it felt more like an offering, a ritual she performed to hold on to some shred of family unity. Jessica sat at the head of the table as though it were hers by right, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the placemat, her phone never far from reach. Ethan lounged beside her, shoulders hunched, but mouth already watering at the sight of the golden crust. Ruth, Margaret's neighbor and oldest friend, occupied the far end, her sharp eyes watching everything though she kept her lips pressed shut. Margaret placed the casserole dish in the center of the table, its savory aroma filling the room, mingling with the faint lemon-scented cleaner she'd used that morning. "Lasagna," she said simply, sliding into her chair. "Your favorite, Ethan." Ethan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Smells great, Mom." Jessica smirked as she served herself a large portion, her fork clicking against the plate. She chewed with exaggerated slowness, then dabbed her lips with her napkin, her voice slicing through the warmth like ice. "Careful with your serving, Margaret. You'll need the calories for your coffin." The room froze. Even the clink of forks stopped. Ethan gave a nervous laugh, more reflex than amusement, eyes darting between his wife and his mother. Ruth shifted in her chair, her expression tightening, but she said nothing. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument could. Margaret didn't reply. She didn't slam her fork down or shout. Instead, she took a measured bite of her lasagna, the tomato tang sharp on her tongue, and let Jessica's words settle inside her like a seed dropped into soil. She chewed slowly, calmly, her gaze fixed on her plate. Every muscle in her face remained still, every ounce of her composure held in place. Jessica leaned back, smug, sipping her wine as if she had just delivered a clever punchline. Ethan reached for his breadstick, his hands fumbling. "She didn't mean it like that," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Margaret lifted her eyes, steady and unreadable. "Eat your dinner," she said quietly. The words carried no anger, no crack in her voice, but the stillness in her tone made Ruth glance up sharply. The rest of the meal unfolded in brittle silence. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked, but conversation never revived. Ruth pushed her food around, her appetite gone. Ethan filled the silence with half-hearted compliments about the meal, but even he gave up when Jessica started scrolling through her phone mid-bite, smiling at something only she saw. Margaret kept eating, each bite deliberate, her silence louder than any outburst could have been. She wasn't swallowing just food. She was swallowing every insult Jessica had ever lobbed at her, storing them like dry tinder. And tonight, Jessica had handed her the match. When the plates were finally cleared, Jessica stretched and stood as though she owned the place. "Thanks for cooking, Margaret." Again, she said with a sugary edge, the faintest curl of triumph in her smile. Ethan followed her upstairs, his steps heavy, his silence heavier. Ruth lingered, stacking her dish neatly by the sink, her eyes locking on Margaret's. "You okay?" Ruth asked softly. Margaret nodded once. "Fine." But Ruth wasn't convinced. She caught the faint stiffness in her friend's shoulders, the way her jaw had set. Still, Ruth didn't push. She left with a quiet good night, her eyes narrowed in thought. Alone in the kitchen, Margaret washed the dishes, the water hot enough to sting her hands. She dried each plate and stacked it carefully, her movements calm, almost ritualistic. The insult still echoed in her ears, not as pain, but as fuel. When the house grew quiet, when Jessica's laughter drifted faintly down from upstairs, Margaret walked to her bedroom. She slid open the bottom drawer of her dresser and pulled out a small brass key. It fit perfectly into the lock of the old file cabinet tucked against the wall. She opened it, the smell of paper and ink rising up like something sacred. Inside, her folders sat neatly labeled, years of order and preparation bound in manila. Her hand paused on the one marked in thick black ink, deed and title. Margaret pulled it out, set it on her lap, and rested her hand against the cover. Jessica thought she had planted cruelty. What she had really planted was Margaret's resolve. Her fingers, stiff from years of cafeteria work and arthritis, worked the metal clasp open. Inside lay neatly stacked documents, each one a testament to her persistence. Property tax receipts, mortgage payoff statements, insurance records, and finally, the deed itself. Creased at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but her name, bold and solitary, clear as the day she signed it. Margaret Doyle, sole owner. No, Ethan. No, Jessica. Just her. She let out a slow breath, the tension in her chest easing slightly. The house was hers in black and white, just as she had always known. But tonight, staring at the page, it felt less like a comfort and more like a weapon she had been sharpening all these years without realizing it. Tucked in the back of the folder was something she had almost forgotten, a single sheet of paper handwritten by Ethan nearly a decade ago. The ink had smudged slightly, his scrawl messy but unmistakable. Temporary stay until we get on our feet. His signature wavered across the bottom, a promise he'd never lived up to. Margaret ran her thumb over the words, her mouth tightening. Temporary had stretched into permanent, and permanent had turned into entitlement. A knock rattled the back door. Ruth let herself in, bundled in a cardigan, her hair pinned back with practical clips. She glanced at the spread of papers across the table and raised an eyebrow. Well, well, looks like you're cooking more than lasagna tonight. Margaret slid the deed across the table. Name's mine. Always has been. Ruth studied it for a moment, then snorted. Then what's the problem? They don't own squat. Toss them, Margaret shook her head. Her voice quiet but firm. Not yet. If I do it now, it'll look like spite. They'll just play victim. Better to let them hand me more rope. Ruth pulled out a chair, lowering herself with a groan. You've got the patience of a saint. I'd have boxed their things up years ago. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she clicked open her phone and scrolled through her feed. Sure enough, Jessica had already posted photos from dinner, her glass of wine positioned just so beside the steaming lasagna. The caption made Margaret's jaw tighten. Thanks for the meal, again. No mention of who bought the ingredients. No acknowledgement of the hours Margaret had spent preparing it. Just a subtle barb, a public reminder that Margaret was their unpaid cook and nothing more. With deliberate care, Margaret took a screenshot. The faint click of the button was as satisfying as slamming a door. Another piece for the file. Another thread in the web Jessica was weaving around herself. Her phone buzzed again, notifications rolling in as Jessica's friends commented with laughing emojis and remarks like, "Lucky you," and "Free food is the best food." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. They didn't see the reality. They only saw Jessica's performance. But reality was sitting in a locked file cabinet, documented down to the cent. She pushed back from the table and walked to the small cabinet by the fridge, where she kept household paperwork. Bills, statements, reminders. She pulled out the most recent stack, expecting the usual routine. But as she shuffled through them, her stomach dropped. Gas, unpaid. Electric, unpaid. Water, past due. Red warning ink scrawled across the top. all in her name. She stood, frozen for a moment, the papers trembling in her hands. They were living under her roof, eating her meals, mocking her at her own table, and now letting her credit dangle on the edge of ruin while they lived carefree upstairs. Margaret set the bills on the table beside the deed, the contrast striking. Ownership on one side, liability on the other. Together, they painted the truth. This wasn't just disrespect. It was neglect. Her lips pressed into a line as she began sliding each unpaid notice into a new binder she pulled from the shelf. On the cover, in bold black marker, she wrote 2 words, tenant neglect. Jessica thought she had planted a coffin joke. What she had really planted was a case file. The morning sun angled through the blinds, painting striped shadows across the kitchen table where the bills sat in a messy pile. Red letters screamed across the envelopes, past due, final notice, immediate payment required. Margaret spread them out like a car dealer, her fingertips brushing over each warning. Gas, water, electric, all in her name. All ignored by the 2 freeloaders upstairs. She set her jaw. Letting them go unpaid wasn't an option. Her credit was hers alone, built over decades of careful budgeting and long cafeteria shifts. She wouldn't let Jessica's arrogance or Ethan's weakness stain that record. With the quiet precision of someone used to balancing trays and ledgers, she logged into each account online. One by one, she paid them, click after click, watching the balances reset to 0. Each payment stung. Not because she couldn't afford it, but because she shouldn't have to. The house wasn't some flop house. It was hers, bought with her husband's sweat and her frugality, preserved with diligence. They treated it like a free motel, and now like a free ride for utilities too. She slid the cleared statements into sheet protectors and tucked them into the binders she had labeled the night before. Tenant neglect. The sound of the metal rings snapping shut was satisfying, like locking a cell door. Page by page, she was building something stronger than anger. She was building proof. Still, she needed certainty. She picked up the phone, dialing the number printed on the corner of one of the bills. After a few rings, a clerk answered, voice bright and hurried. "This is Columbus Utilities. How can I help?" Margaret spoke evenly. "I'm calling about account 4215, address 314 Meadow Lane. I need confirmation. Whose name is listed as the responsible party?" The clerk tapped at keys, the faint clicking filling the pause. "That would be Margaret Doyle." "Only me?" "Yes, ma'am." "You are solely responsible," Margaret thanked her and hung up. The confirmation wasn't a shock, but it landed with finality. Ethan and Jessica weren't just careless. They were reckless with her name. Every unpaid notice risked her future, not theirs. Ruth stopped by that afternoon, slipping in through the back door with a bag of groceries. She spotted the binder on the table and tilted her head. "What's this? Homework?" Margaret opened it, flipping to the page with the utility statements. "Evidence." Ruth's eyes widened, a grin tugging at her lips. "Now you're speaking my language." She lowered her voice as though sharing a neighborhood secret. "I know someone, Paula Grant. Legal aid attorney. She eats freeloaders for breakfast." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Is she good?" "Good?" Ruth smirked. "She once cleared out a family of squatters faster than a snow shovel clears a porch. Practical, direct. Ruthless when she needs to be. You'd like her." The name stuck in Margaret's mind. That night, after the house had gone quiet, she looked Paula up on her old desktop computer. Reviews matched Ruth's description. Efficient, no nonsense, skilled in tenant-landlord disputes. Margaret clicked schedule consultation and filled in her details with the same meticulous care she gave her paperwork. She didn't feel triumphant as she closed the computer. She felt steady. Every insult, every unpaid bill, every mocking remark was now turning into something solid. The next morning, she brewed her coffee and carried it to the kitchen. The smell of roasted beans wrapped around her, comforting in its familiarity. She reached for the fridge to pull out milk and froze. A square of paper was stuck to the door with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Jessica's handwriting curved across it in looping script, sharp with smugness. You should downsize soon. This house is too big for you. Margaret stood there, her coffee cooling in her hand, her reflection staring back from the fridge door. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with deliberate calm, she peeled the note off, folded it once, and slid it into the binder with the rest of the evidence. They thought their words would shrink her, but every jab only gave her more weight to throw back. The strip mall on the edge of Columbus was a patchwork of ordinary life. A nail salon with faded posters in the window, a payday loan office buzzing with fluorescent lights, a laundromat that smelled faintly of bleach. Tucked between them was a narrow office with a simple sign stenciled on the glass. Paula Grant, attorney at law. Margaret paused before pushing the door open. The bell above it jingled softly, and the faint scent of stale coffee and copier toner filled the air. A receptionist gave her a quick smile and gestured toward a door marked Consultations. Inside, Paula Grant sat behind a desk stacked with files. She was mid-40s, sharp-eyed, her dark hair cut into a practical bob. A navy blazer hung neatly over her chair, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest she wasn't afraid to work. She gestured to the seat opposite her. "Margaret Doyle?" Margaret nodded, placing her binder on the desk. "That's me." Paula leaned back, her tone brisk but not unkind. "Before we dive in, I'll ask you one thing straight. Do you want peace, or do you want payback?" Margaret met her gaze, her voice low but steady. "I want eviction." A slow smile curved across Paula's face, not cruel, but approving. "Then let's see what we've got." Margaret opened her binder, sliding out the documents with a precision that impressed even Paula. Deed. Title, temporary stay note. Utility bills. Screenshots of Jessica's barbs. Paula flipped through them quickly, her pen tapping against the desk in rhythm with her thoughts. When she looked up, her expression was sharp. They're squatters with lipstick. No lease, no payments, no ownership. They've got about as much claim as a stranger off the street. She tapped the utility bills. And they're damaging your credit on top of it. Perfect evidence. Margaret sat straighter, her hands folded on her lap. "So what happens now?" Paula pulled a fresh form from her drawer, sliding it into the typewriter stationed at the edge of the desk. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of keys filled the office as she typed with swift efficiency. The words took shape. 30-day eviction notice. Margaret watched, her chest tightening with something between relief and anticipation. She'd carried this anger quietly for years, but seeing it turn into legal action made it real. When the page was finished, Paula slid it across the desk, her eyes locking on Margaret's. "Here it is. One notice. You post this, and the clock starts. 30 days. Margaret picked up the paper, feeling the weight of it. "I'll serve it when the moment's right." Paula leaned back, crossing her arms. "Good. Timing matters. But be ready, they'll fight dirty. Jessica strikes me as the type who'd rather burn a house down than admit she doesn't own it." Margaret allowed the faintest smile. "Then I'll keep the extinguisher close." As she left the office, the sun was already setting, throwing streaks of orange across the strip mall parking lot. She slid the eviction notice into her binder, locking the clasp with finality. For the first time in years, she felt not just like a homeowner, but like the rightful one. That night, back at the dinner table, the house was thick with the smell of leftover lasagna reheated in the oven. Margaret ate in silence while Ethan fiddled with his fork. Jessica, sprawled comfortably in Margaret's chair at the head of the table, poured herself another glass of wine. She leaned over to Ethan, her smirk curling at the edges. "Relax. She'll croak before she ever kicks us out." The house was quiet that morning, the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. Margaret rose before dawn, the air cool against her skin as she slipped on her cardigan. The eviction notice lay on her dresser, crisp and white, waiting like a blade she had kept sheathed long enough. She carried it upstairs, the boards creaking softly under her weight. The smell of coffee still clung to her sweater, mingling with the faint perfume Jessica always left behind in the hallway. Margaret paused outside their bedroom door, the faint hum of the television seeping through. With steady hands, she taped the notice right at eye level, centered like a bullseye. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She turned and went back downstairs, her footsteps calm and deliberate. The scream came minutes later, slicing through the quiet like shattered glass. "What is this?" Jessica's voice rang down the stairwell, shrill and furious. The door slammed open and footsteps pounded on the stairs. Ethan followed, still half-dressed, his hair rumpled. He clutched the notice in his hand, his face pale. "Mom, you wouldn't—" Margaret looked up from her coffee at the kitchen table, her face serene. 30 days. Jessica's heels clicked furiously across the tile as she stormed into the kitchen, waving the notice like a weapon. "You can't just throw us out. This is our home too." Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "It's my home. You've been guests far too long." Jessica's mouth opened and closed, rage twisting her features. Ethan's eyes darted between them, sweat beading at his temple. "Mom, please, this isn't necessary. We'll figure something out." "You had years to figure it out," Margaret said evenly. She lifted her cup and took a slow sip. The clink of porcelain against the saucer, the only sound. From next door, Ruth sat on her porch with her morning tea, the shouting echoing through the thin walls of the cul-de-sac. She took a slow sip, her eyes narrowing with satisfaction. The sound of Jessica's fury was music to her ears. By mid-morning, Margaret's phone buzzed with a message from Paula. "Notice served." Margaret typed back a single word. "Yes." Paula's reply came instantly. "Good." Now we watched them scramble. And scramble they did. Jessica stormed through the house all day, slamming cabinets, making loud phone calls, threatening lawsuits to anyone who would listen. Ethan trailed behind her like a shadow, wringing his hands, his words drowned out by her venom. Margaret moved through it all with the calm of someone who had already won, her binder of documents tucked safely into her desk drawer. That evening, the confrontation reached its boiling point. Jessica cornered Margaret in the living room, her eyes glittering with rage. Ethan hovered behind her, silent. Jessica thrust the notice toward her again, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You think you can humiliate us? You think you can just throw us out after everything we've done for this place?" Margaret looked around the room, the scratched furniture, the unpaid bills stuffed into drawers, the layers of disrespect etched into every corner, and met Jessica's glare. "Yes." Jessica's breath caught, her face reddening. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Then she hissed, low and venomous, "We'll fight this in court." "You'll regret it." Margaret didn't flinch. She turned and walked away, the eviction notice still clutched in Jessica's trembling hand. Upstairs, a cabinet slammed. Downstairs, the quiet returned. But Margaret knew this was just the beginning. The county courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and paper, its tiled halls echoing with footsteps that rose and fell like waves. Margaret walked slowly but deliberately toward the hearing room, her binder pressed to her chest. She had dressed in her best navy coat, her hair pinned neatly, her shoes shined. To her, this wasn't just a court date, it was a reckoning. Jessica arrived late, sweeping in with a practiced air of confidence. She wore a blazer that looked one size too expensive for her budget, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. At her side slouched a thin man with a cheap briefcase and an even cheaper suit, a lawyer Margaret didn't recognize. Ethan trailed behind them, looking as though he wished he could vanish, his tie askew, his eyes never leaving the floor. Inside the courtroom, the judge took his seat, a stack of files already waiting before him. His voice was calm but clipped. "Doyle versus Doyle. Eviction proceeding. Let's hear it." Jessica's lawyer stood first, clearing his throat with unnecessary drama. "Your Honor, my clients have been living at 314 Meadow Lane under the belief that ownership of the property had been verbally transferred to them years ago. It was understood to be a permanent arrangement. Jessica folded her arms smugly, her eyes sliding toward Margaret with a look that said, "Try to top that." Ethan nodded weakly, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, that's what we thought." Paula rose slowly, adjusting her blazer, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Your Honor, with all due respect, what they've presented is nothing but hot air. There is no written lease, no deed in their names, no evidence beyond wishful thinking." She lifted Margaret's binder and opened it with a crisp snap. "But what we do have is proof." One by one, she laid the documents on the judge's bench. The deed with Margaret's name alone, in bold black letters. The stack of tax receipts, each signed and paid by her. Utility bills in her name, paid despite repeated neglect by the occupants. Paula's voice never wavered as she walked through each page, the sound of paper sliding across wood punctuating her argument. Margaret sat still, her hands folded in her lap, but inside she felt the steady satisfaction of years of careful record-keeping paying off. Each paper was another brick in the wall she was building between herself and their lies. The judge skimmed the documents, his brow furrowing slightly, then lifted his gaze. "The evidence is clear. Ownership rests solely with Mrs. Doyle. The claim of verbal transfer is unsupported and carries no legal weight." He turned slightly, his tone firm. "This case proceeds to a formal eviction hearing. We'll set a date for final ruling." Jessica's face flushed red, her lips pressing together as though the words were acid in her mouth. She leaned back in her chair, muttering something under her breath. Margaret didn't react outwardly, but her ears caught it clearly. "Old hag." Paula placed a hand lightly on Margaret's arm, a silent signal not to rise to the bait. But Margaret didn't need to. She already knew words could be as dangerous as deeds, and sometimes more useful. The session adjourned. Quickly after that, the shuffle of papers and the creak of wooden benches filling the silence. Jessica stomped out of the courtroom, Ethan scurrying behind her, his head ducked low. Margaret lingered for a moment, gathering her papers with careful precision. She slipped her phone into her pocket, its red light still glowing faintly. In the heat of Jessica's fury, she had thought no one was listening. But Margaret had pressed record before the muttering began. As she stepped out into the cool spring air, the recording safe in her pocket, she allowed herself the smallest smile. Jessica thought her insults disappeared in the air. Margaret knew they'd play back loud and clear. The second court date was smaller, quieter, just a handful of cases on the docket. The kind of weekday session where clerks yawned behind their desks and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Margaret sat at the petitioner's table, her binder once again in front of her, though this time her weapon wasn't paper. It was tucked neatly inside her phone. Jessica strutted in as if she'd already won, her blazer wrinkled at the edges, her lipstick sharp and precise. Ethan trailed behind her, his shoulders slumped, his tie loose like a noose he couldn't escape. Margaret didn't rise to meet their eyes. She simply set her phone on the table, screen dark but ready. The judge, a man with thinning hair and sharp glasses perched low on his nose, adjusted his files. "We're here to review evidence before the eviction hearing proceeds. Counsel, present what you've got." Jessica's bargain bin lawyer repeated the same tired claim about verbal transfer, his voice monotone, his words already losing air before they hit the wood of the bench. Jessica nodded vigorously, arms crossed as though confidence could substitute for proof. When he finally sat down, Paula rose, calm as ever, her tone clipped but cutting. "Your Honor, last time we showed you the deed, the tax receipts, the bills. Today, we bring something new." She nodded once to Margaret. Margaret tapped her phone, the speaker crackling as the recording filled the courtroom. Jessica's voice spilled out, hushed but venomous. "We'll bury her before she buries us." The words hung in the air like smoke. Even the clerk looked up, startled. The judge's eyebrows lifted. His pen paused, mid-note. "Is that Mrs. Doyle?" Margaret's voice was steady, though the echo of those words still stung. Yes, Your Honor. That's what she said after the last hearing. Jessica shot up, her voice shrill. That's out of context. I didn't mean. The judge raised a hand, silencing her. He turned to Paula. What's your interpretation? Paula didn't flinch. Pattern of intimidation, Your Honor. Not just disrespect. A threat, whispered, because she thought it wouldn't be heard. But it was. Loud and clear. Margaret clasped her hands together in her lap, her voice softer now, almost weary. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted peace in my own home. The judge studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing as though weighing the scales. Then he set his pen down firmly. Threats have no place in this courtroom or in someone's home. I see no reason to drag this out any further. He leaned forward, his voice decisive. The eviction timeline is expedited. 14 days, Jessica gasped, her face going scarlet. Ethan slumped lower, looking as though he'd shrink into the bench if given the chance. Margaret didn't smile. She simply exhaled, a breath that carried years of patience and months of humiliation. 2 weeks. That was all that stood between her and her house. The gavel struck once, and the session ended. Jessica stormed out, her heels clacking like gunfire against the courthouse floor. Ethan followed, silent and pale, his hands shoved into his pockets. Margaret lingered with Paula, who tucked the phone back into her bag with a satisfied smirk. They thought intimidation would buy them time. Instead, it cost them 2 weeks. Outside, the spring air felt lighter. Margaret lifted her face to it, letting the breeze wash over her. For the first time, she could see the end of this nightmare. But Jessica wasn't done fighting, not in the courtroom, at least. That evening, Margaret's phone buzzed with notifications. Neighbors, friends, even her old co-workers from the school cafeteria were sending her screenshots. On Facebook, Jessica had posted a long, furious rant. We're being thrown out by a cruel old woman who cares more about paper than family. Imagine evicting your own son and grandchildren. Heartless. The words bled across the screen, paired with a selfie of Jessica's tear-streaked face. Ethan blurred in the background like an unwilling prop. Margaret read it once, then twice, her jaw tightening. She didn't comment. She didn't reply. Instead, she opened her binder and slid a fresh sheet of printer paper into the sleeve, labeled Evidence. Another lie, documented. Another thread in the net she was weaving tight around them. By the next morning, Margaret's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications stacked one on top of another. A cascade of screenshots forwarded from neighbors and friends. Jessica's late-night Facebook rant had already made its rounds, but the real story wasn't Jessica's words. It was the reaction. The comments section beneath Jessica's tearful selfie had taken a turn she hadn't expected. At first, her friends offered sympathy, dropping heart emojis and gasps of disbelief. But then came the sharper voices, the ones that cut through the performance. Wait, isn't that Margaret's house? Didn't she buy it years ago? Everyone knows that place is hers. By mid-morning, the tide had shifted completely. One post in particular sealed it. Joan, the retired accountant who lived 2 streets over, had shared a screenshot straight from the Franklin County Auditor's website. Margaret Doyle's name glared in bold at the top of the property record. The caption beneath was simple, pointed. Receipts don't lie. Jessica tried to claw her way back into control, replying with frantic comments. She promised it to us. We've invested so much into this house, but the replies came fast and merciless. Invested? With what? Free rent. Promise isn't paperwork. Ungrateful. She raised you, and this is how you repay her. Margaret didn't add a word to the thread. She didn't need to. Her neighbors were doing the work for her, unraveling Jessica's carefully spun web in real time. That afternoon, Ruth stopped by, her laugh echoing before she even set foot in the kitchen. She plopped into a chair, setting her phone on the table. Well, they sure lit themselves on fire this time. Half the neighborhood's talking about it. Jessica deleted the post 10 minutes ago. Margaret sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her. Doesn't matter. Screenshots live longer than rants. Ruth smirked, folding her arms. The internet's faster than eviction notices. Margaret glanced at the binders sitting open on the counter, page after page of bills, deeds, and records neatly stacked. Maybe so, she said softly, but I'll still finish it the right way. The house remained tense that evening. Jessica barely came out of the bedroom, her footsteps loud and angry whenever she did. Ethan moved quietly, as if hoping invisibility might spare him the crossfire. Margaret cooked her dinner in silence, the smell of roasted chicken and thyme filling the air, and carried her plate to the table as though nothing had changed. But change was already on its way. 2 mornings later, the knock came, firm, unmistakable. Margaret opened the door to find a sheriff's deputy on her porch, his boots damp from the rain, the faint scent of leather clinging to his jacket. He carried a sheet of paper folded against a clipboard. "Mrs. Doyle?" he asked. Margaret nodded. He handed her the document. Eviction order authorized by the court. Effective immediately, 14 days. Without waiting for a reply, he stepped past her and pressed the notice onto the front door, smoothing the tape with a practiced hand. The sound of it ripping free from the roll and slapping against the wood echoed through the hall. Eviction order, vacate in 14 days. Upstairs, blinds shifted. Margaret caught the shadow of Jessica watching from the bedroom window before it snapped shut again. The deputy tipped his cap. "We'll check back after the deadline. If they're not out, we'll help them out." Margaret thanked him quietly, then stood back as his cruiser pulled away. The cul-de-sac was still, the air damp and cool, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze. It was official now, not just her word against theirs, not just screenshots or whispers. The law was nailed to her front door for all to see. Behind her, the house remained silent, but she could feel the rage building upstairs. Jessica's lies had unraveled online, but here, on this porch, in black and white, was the truth she couldn't delete. 14 days passed like stones dropping into a well, silent, heavy, and irreversible. The eviction order fluttered on the door until the tape curled at the corners. Neighbors noticed it every time they passed. Margaret noticed the way Jessica avoided the front porch altogether, slipping in through the garage like a thief in her own fantasy kingdom. Boxes never appeared. Suitcases never left the house. Jessica and Ethan ignored the order as if pretending would erase it. Margaret said nothing. She cooked her dinners, folded her laundry, and waited with the patience of someone who knew time wasn't on their side. On the 15th morning, the sheriff's cruiser rolled back into the cul-de-sac. This time there were no flashing lights, just the solid presence of authority pulling into the driveway. Curtains lifted across the street. Ruth was already on her porch with her tea, waiting like it was a front-row ticket to justice. The deputy climbed the steps and knocked firmly, his voice carrying. "Occupants of 314 Meadow Lane, you are in violation of a court order. You have 72 hours to vacate voluntarily. After that, we'll remove you with movers and law enforcement." Jessica burst out first, hair disheveled, eyes red from a night of rage. "This is harassment. We're not leaving. We've lived here for years." Ethan followed, wringing his hands, his shirt half buttoned. His voice cracked with desperation. "Mom, please." "Not at Christmas. The kids won't understand." Margaret stepped onto the porch, binder tucked under her arm, her face steady as stone. She looked directly at her son. "You told me I was uninvited to my own table. Now you're uninvited from my house." Ethan's lips trembled. He said nothing. Jessica, though, wasn't finished. She shoved the deputy's shoulder with the eviction notice, her voice shrill. "You can't just throw us into the street." The deputy didn't even blink. "Court order stands." 72 hours, he retaped the notice to the door, pressing it flat against the wood. The slap of the tape echoed through the still morning. Across the lawn, Ruth raised her mug in a mock toast, her smile sharp as a blade. The neighbors watching from their windows saw everything: the badge, the order, the humiliation. Whispers would spread before lunch. That night, the house was a pressure cooker. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, eating roast chicken in silence, the savory scent filling the air. Upstairs, she heard the stomping, Jessica pacing, slamming drawers, dragging something heavy across the floor. Ethan's muffled voice rose and fell, pleading, never commanding. Margaret chewed slowly, her fork scraping against porcelain, the calm in her chest growing deeper with every bite. They had 72 hours. After that, it wouldn't be her problem. But then came the crash, a plate hitting tile, shards scattering like rain. Margaret froze, listening. Jessica's voice cut through the silence, jagged with fury. "I'll ruin this house before she gets it back." The words sank like ice into the floorboards. Margaret set her fork down, her hands still, her pulse steady. If Jessica thought destruction would scare her into surrender, she was wrong. Every scratch, every crack, every broken plate would become one more page in the binder. They thought eviction was the end. Margaret knew it was just the beginning of restitution. Morning after Jessica's threat, the house told its own story. Margaret walked through each room in silence, the way a detective inspects a crime scene. She carried her phone in her hand, camera ready, her eyes sharp. The first thing she saw was the dining room floor, porcelain shards glittering like ice across the tile, the jagged edges catching the morning light. The plate Jessica had smashed lay in pieces, its floral pattern splintered into dust. Margaret crouched low, photographing it from every angle, the faint smell of vinegar from last night's roast still lingering in the air. She moved next to the hallway, her fingertips brushing over deep scratches carved into the paint near the door frame. It looked deliberate, keys dragged down in long, ugly lines. Margaret snapped close-ups, her reflection faint in the glossy paint. Upstairs, one of the cabinet doors in the bathroom dangled crookedly. Its hinge cracked. She steadied it with her hand, took another picture, then let it swing back open with a hollow thud. Each room had something small, a wound left behind like a calling card, and each wound became a photo, cataloged and saved. By mid-morning, Margaret had filled a folder on her phone. She stood in the kitchen, scrolling through the images, her jaw tight. Jessica thought destruction would erase her dignity. Instead, she'd handed Margaret more evidence. Margaret dialed the insurance adjuster first, her voice calm and professional as she explained. "Yes, deliberate damage. My tenants are being evicted." The adjuster promised to send someone out, and Margaret made a note in her binder. Her next call was to the sheriff's office. The same deputy from before listened as she laid it out. Broken fixtures, intentional scratches, threats overheard. His tone was flat but firm. Document everything. Courts look at evidence, not stories. That afternoon, Paula's number lit up on her screen. Margaret explained what she'd found. Each detail measured, each photo described. Paula didn't hesitate. "Good. We'll tack damages onto the eviction. Judges love clean documentation. You're not just evicting them, you're charging them for the mess they leave behind." Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile. They thought they were hurting me. They're only hurting themselves. When the day of the restitution hearing arrived, the courtroom felt tighter than before. Jessica swept in ahead of Ethan, her hair pulled back in a too-tight bun, her lips painted a harsh red. She looked like she was dressed for battle, but the wild flicker in her eyes betrayed her. Ethan trailed behind, his gaze pinned to the floor as though the tile might swallow him whole. Jessica's lawyer, still cheap, still fumbling, tried to wave the damages away. "Normal wear and tear," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing more." Paula rose with the confidence of someone holding a winning hand. She placed a neat stack of printed photos on the judge's bench, scratches, shattered porcelain, broken hinges. Each image was undeniable. "Your Honor," Paula said crisply, "this isn't wear and tear. This is retaliation. This is destruction, documented in full." Jessica shot to her feet, her voice sharp, desperate. "That's not true. She staged those pictures. She's lying." The judge's gaze flicked from Jessica's wild eyes to the photos in front of him, then to Margaret, who sat calm and silent, her binder closed on her lap. He shook his head once. The evidence speaks louder than your words, Mrs. Doyle. Jessica sat down hard, her face pale beneath the makeup. Ethan didn't move, his head bowed, his hands gripping his knees. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Restitution hearing approved. Defendants will be held accountable for damages to the property. His tone carried the finality of a slammed door. Margaret left the courtroom without a glance at Jessica. She didn't need to see her face to know it was crumbling. By the time she arrived back at Meadow Lane, the proof of collapse was parked at the curb. Moving trucks, hulking and white, engines humming, sat in the driveway like vultures waiting to pick the last scraps clean. The moving trucks arrived before dawn, their diesel engines growling low in the driveway. The sound rattled through the cul-de-sac, drawing curtains open and waking curious neighbors who'd been following the drama like a serialized show. Margaret stood at the window, the glow of the streetlight illuminating her face. She didn't flinch at the sight. This was the ending she had planned for, piece by piece, document by document. The trucks weren't hers to fear. They were hers to savor. Inside, Jessica stormed from room to room, yanking clothes from closets, stuffing them haphazardly into boxes. Her movements were frantic, her perfume hanging heavy in the air, masking the sour tang of sweat. Tape ripped and snapped as she sealed cartons with more force than necessary, each pull of the tape like a whip. Ethan hovered near the staircase, holding a half-empty box as though it might anchor him. He finally found his voice, low and almost apologetic. "Mom, I didn't mean it to end like this." Margaret turned from the window, her expression even. She didn't raise her voice, didn't soften. "You let her speak for both of you." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Ethan looked away, his shoulders caving inward, his lips pressing shut. He didn't argue. He couldn't. From across the street, Ruth sat on her porch with a blanket around her shoulders and her ever-present mug of tea steaming in her hand. A neighbor leaned over, whispering something, and Ruth chuckled softly. "Poetic," she said aloud, her voice carrying just enough for Margaret to hear through the open window. "Public." And it was public. Neighbors lined their porches, arms folded, lips moving in hushed tones. Some shook their heads, others smiled, grimly. For years they'd watched Jessica strut through the neighborhood, acting as though she owned the very ground she walked on. Now they watched her stumble, dragging her life into cardboard boxes under the eyes of everyone she'd tried to impress. By mid-afternoon, the driveway was a mess of stacked furniture and plastic bins. Jessica barked orders at the movers, her voice sharp and brittle. She slammed a drawer shut so hard the wood cracked, then muttered curses under her breath. Each bang and crash echoed through the hollowing house. Margaret stayed in the kitchen, her binder still resting on the counter like a quiet sentinel. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the aroma warm and steady, filling the air that had so long been heavy with tension. The contrast was almost jarring. Upstairs, chaos. Downstairs, calm. Ethan came into the kitchen once, his eyes red, his voice hoarse. "Mom, if we had more time." Margaret cut him off gently but firmly. "Time was what I gave you." "Years of it." He nodded, defeated, and slipped back upstairs. By early evening, the house looked gutted. The once proud furniture Stephanie had bragged about on social media was wrapped in blankets and wheeled out the door. The dining room table, the same one where Jessica had smirked and delivered her coffin joke, was dismantled, its legs stacked awkwardly in the truck. Finally, Jessica stomped down the stairs, carrying the last box. Her hair was frizzed, her face streaked with sweat and fury. She paused at the doorway, glaring at Margaret as if daring her to say something. Margaret didn't. Silence was the sharper blade. Jessica's chest rose and fell rapidly. Then, with one final burst of spite, she shoved the door hard enough that it rattled in its frame, the slam echoing down the hall. The moving truck's engine roared to life. Neighbors began drifting back inside, satisfied with the show. Ruth stayed seated, sipping her tea until the last box was loaded and the truck finally pulled away. And then it happened. The house went quiet. Not the tense, suffocating quiet that had lived there for years, but a stillness that felt clean, as though the very walls exhaled with relief. Margaret stood in the middle of the empty living room, listening to the silence. It was the sound of freedom, hers at last. The silence after the moving trucks vanished was almost sacred, but silence doesn't scrub floors. Margaret tied on her old apron, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped into the mess Jessica had left behind. The dining room reeked faintly of sour wine and dust. A streak of spaghetti sauce, long dried, clung stubbornly to the wall near the baseboard. Margaret filled a bucket with hot water and vinegar, the sharp scent rising in the air, and knelt to scrub until the white paint shone again. Upstairs, the bathroom floor was littered with clumps of hair dye, purple stains along the grout. Margaret leaned into the work, gloves squeaking against tile, humming under her breath. The rhythm of cleaning soothed her, the steady back and forth of reclaiming space inch by inch. But the worst offender was the living room. Jessica's proud accent wall, a garish shade of neon teal, stared at Margaret like an insult. She opened the windows wide, the spring air rushing in, and rolled the first coat of warm beige over it. With every stroke of the roller, the teal vanished beneath a calm, timeless color. It wasn't just paint. It was erasure, reclamation. By dusk, Margaret had dragged her old china cabinet from storage in the garage. Its oak panels gleamed faintly in the fading light. The familiar creak of its doors, a welcome sound. She placed it against the freshly painted wall, smoothing the lace runner across the top. One by one, she unpacked her china, plates she and her husband had collected through the years, delicate cups wrapped in yellowed newspaper. The cabinet filled with quiet history, displacing every trace of Jessica's gaudy trinkets. The house began to smell different too. Margaret slid a casserole into the oven, layers of noodles, cheese, and sauce bubbling together. The savory aroma drifted through the rooms, replacing the staleness of perfume and anger with something warm, something hers. She set the table for two, though she didn't expect company. Old habits lingered. A knock at the back door startled her, but it was only Ruth, wrapped in her cardigan. She stepped inside, breathing deeply. "Well, I'll be damned." "It smells like your house again," Margaret laughed softly, pulling the casserole from the oven. The cheese stretched golden and bubbling, filling the kitchen with the kind of warmth no candle could fake. Ruth leaned against the counter, eyeing the freshly painted wall in the next room. "Like the bad spirits are gone." Margaret slid the casserole onto the table, her voice calm, certain. They were. The two women ate together, the scrape of forks against ceramic the only sound for a while. For the first time in years, Margaret tasted her food without bitterness. The next day, Paula stopped by, dropping her leather briefcase on the counter. She looked around with an approving nod. "You've worked fast. Smells better, too." She pulled out her planner, flipping to the marked date. "Restitution hearing is in 2 weeks. We'll nail down damages officially." Margaret nodded, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Good. The walls are clean. Now it's time to clean the books," Paula smirked, taking a sip. "Jessica's not going to like it," Margaret shrugged. "She hasn't liked anything since she moved in." They shared a quiet laugh, but the peace didn't last. That evening, as Margaret sat with her binder at the kitchen table, her phone buzzed. A new notification from the court portal glowed on the screen. Counterclaim filed. Unlawful eviction. Plaintiff, Jessica Doyle. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. Jessica hadn't left the fight behind with her boxes. She was trying to twist the story once more, this time with the law. Margaret closed the binder softly, the snap of the rings echoing in the empty kitchen. Jessica thought she'd found a new weapon. Margaret knew she'd only handed her another chance to lose. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning, the hum of the fluorescent lights blending with the shuffle of papers and the muted coughs of those waiting their turn. Margaret sat at the petitioner's table, her binder closed in front of her, her fingers resting lightly on its cover. She didn't need to open it this time. Paula had everything ready. Jessica strutted in with Ethan dragging behind, her heels clacking against the linoleum. She wore a fitted blazer, her lipstick too bright for the dim room, her chin raised in defiance. She handed a packet to her lawyer, whispering furiously as though the right words might still save her. Ethan said nothing, his face pale, his eyes on the ground. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the case notes. Counterclaim filed by Mrs. Jessica Doyle, claiming unlawful eviction. Is counsel prepared to proceed? Jessica's lawyer rose, clearing his throat as if that might add weight to his weak argument. Yes, Your Honor. My clients assert that Mrs. Doyle forced them from their home without proper process. They contend that verbal agreements. Paula stood before he could finish, her tone crisp as frost. Your Honor, we're here today not for vague memories, but for facts, and I have one to play for the court. She tapped her tablet, and the recording Margaret had captured months ago filled the room. Jessica's own voice echoed off the walls, dripping with disdain. Careful, you'll need the calories for your coffin. Gasps rippled through the room. A murmur swelled in the gallery as people leaned closer, some shaking their heads. The insult was cruel enough on its own, but paired with the eviction claim, it was devastating. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing at Jessica. And you lived under her roof, rent-free, for how long? Jessica's face blanched. Her lawyer stammered, Well, Your Honor, context. Paula cut him off smoothly. Context is irrelevant. Here's the deed. She handed it to the bailiff, who placed it on the bench. Margaret's name glowed at the top, undisputed. Here's the eviction order, signed and enforced by the court. And here, Paula slid a stack of glossy photos across, are the damages they left behind. Scratches, broken cabinets, shattered property. The judge flipped through each one, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he set them down and looked squarely at Jessica. Counterclaim dismissed. Instantly, Jessica gasped, her hands tightening on the table's edge. Ethan didn't move, his shoulders slumped deeper. The judge's voice carried finality. Restitution hearing stands. Jessica and Ethan Doyle are ordered to pay damages for destruction of property. He struck his gavel once, the sound sharp as a hammer blow. The gallery buzzed with murmurs. A man in the back whispered, Rent-free and still breaking things. Another woman shook her head, muttering, Ungrateful kids. Margaret didn't bask in it, though she felt the shift in the air. The humiliation wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to them. Jessica's face twisted, rage and shame warring beneath her makeup. She shoved her chair back so hard it screeched across the floor. This isn't over, she spat, her voice cracking. But the room didn't react. No one defended her, no one pitied her. She stormed toward the exit, heels pounding the tile like gunfire. Ethan followed, silent and gray, his head bowed low, not even glancing back at his mother. Margaret stayed seated, her binder untouched. She didn't need to move quickly. Justice had already walked out the door, leaving Jessica in pieces. The first dinner in her reclaimed house felt like a kind of baptism. Margaret set the table carefully, smoothing the lace cloth her mother had passed down, arranging mismatched plates that somehow looked right together. The house smelled of butter and onions, of pies cooling on the counter, of casseroles bubbling in the oven. Every window was cracked open just enough to let the night air slip in, carrying the faint sound of neighbors chatting on porches. When Ruth arrived first, she carried a lemon pie, its crust golden and fragrant. Thought you could use something sweet, she said, her grin wide. Everything's already sweet enough, Margaret replied, hugging her before guiding her inside. Paula arrived not long after, trading her courtroom sharpness for a cardigan and jeans. She carried a basket of rolls still warm, wrapped in a towel. I figured we could all use carbs that aren't arguments. By the time a few neighbors joined, Joan with her husband, Mrs. Keller from next door, the dining table was nearly buried. 3 casseroles, mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, pies of every flavor, and pitchers of cider gleaming amber under the lights. They sat together, the scrape of chairs against wood, the murmur of voices filling what had once been silence too thick to breathe. Laughter came easily, bouncing off the freshly painted walls that no longer bore teal scars. Margaret ladled steaming casserole onto plates, the smell of cheese and tomatoes making her mouth water. She listened to Ruth teasing Paula about her stubborn streak, to Joan recounting how the neighborhood buzzed when the sheriff's cruiser pulled up. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It sounded like home. At one point, Margaret leaned back, her fork resting against her plate, her eyes traveling over the scene. She caught Ruth's eye, then Paula's, and said softly, "This is how a house should sound." Ruth lifted her glass, cider sparkling in the light, to feeding Eviction instead of insult. Everyone chuckled, glasses clinking together. Margaret raised hers last, her hand steady, her heart finally light. The meal stretched on into the evening, the room warm with the heat of ovens and bodies, the air rich with scents of cinnamon, butter, and roasted meat. Stories flowed freely. Paula told one about a tenant who tried to pay rent and chickens. Ruth recalled the time she chased off kids stealing from her mailbox. Margaret listened, smiled, and added her own memories when asked. No one interrupted her. No one mocked her. No one dismissed her words. After dessert, the group lingered in the living room. The china cabinet gleamed in its rightful place, and the beige walls glowed softly in the lamplight. Ruth dozed a little on the couch, her empty pie plate balanced on her lap. Paula leaned against the armrest, sipping tea. Margaret sat in her armchair, the hum of contentment filling her ears. The house felt alive again, not with chaos, but with comfort. When the guests finally drifted out into the night, Margaret stood at the doorway, waving as their taillights disappeared down the street. She turned back into the quiet house and let the peace sink into her bones. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for footsteps that weren't hers. 2 days later, the mail arrived in a neat stack. Margaret carried it inside, flipping through envelopes. Electric bill, a letter from Paula's office, and then the familiar red and green cards of the season. One from Joan and her husband, another from Mrs. Keller, even one from an old co-worker at the school cafeteria. She arranged them on the mantel, the colors bright against the wall, but there were none from Ethan, none from Jessica, not even a signature, not even a pre-printed greeting. Margaret stared at the row of cards, her lips curving into a slow smile. Their silence was its own kind of gift. The morning sun draped the porch in gold, its warmth cutting through the crisp December air. Margaret sat in her wicker chair with a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. The scent of roasted beans mixed with the faint tang of pine from the wreath on her door. The house behind her was silent, but not empty. It breathed again, walls steady, floors unscarred by shouting. The street was alive with quiet rhythms, a dog's collar jingling as it tugged its owner down the sidewalk, the crunch of tires as neighbors pulled out for errands, the laughter of children tossing a ball across a yard. Each sound threaded into the morning like proof that life went on. But for Margaret, it felt different. It felt hers. Neighbors waved as they passed, some pausing to offer a word. Mrs. Keller slowed her walk to lean over the fence. "The place looks beautiful, Margaret. Peace suits it." Margaret smiled, lifting her mug in return. "Peace suits me too." Ruth arrived next, padding across the grass in slippers, a second mug of tea in her hand. She lowered herself into the chair beside Margaret with a satisfied sigh. "Feels good, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice warm with a kind of pride only a friend could carry. Margaret glanced at the freshly painted shutters, the gleam of her china cabinet visible through the window, the faint smell of casserole still lingering in the air from last night's dinner. Her smile deepened. Better than any insult could sting. They sat together in companionable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. For years, the porch had been a place of tension, Jessica's sharp voice drifting out to the yard, Ethan's excuses soft and hollow. Now, the only voices belonged to friends and neighbors, none of them carrying cruelty. At one point, Margaret rose and stepped inside. The house was cool and dim, the morning light pooling across the floorboards. She walked to the mantel where the Christmas cards stood neatly in a row. Bright reds and greens, glittering foil, handwritten notes from neighbors, co-workers, even Ruth's granddaughter. Above them hung a simple frame. Inside, the deed. Margaret's name etched in bold, unchallenged letters. She rested her hand against the glass, her reflection faint but steady. The memory of Jessica's smirk flickered, the cruel words at her own dinner table. "Careful, you'll need the calories for your coffin." Margaret remembered the sting, the weight of silence, the way her son had laughed weakly instead of defending her. That night had planted something in her, not death, but resolve. Now the words had lost their teeth. The house itself had become the answer. Margaret returned to the porch, settling beside Ruth again. The coffee had cooled, but she didn't mind. The warmth was in the air, in the house, in the quiet victory she didn't need to parade. The moving trucks were gone. Jessica's voice was gone. Ethan's apologies were gone. What remained was hers, legally, emotionally, forever. Margaret leaned back, her voice soft but unshakable. My son's wife smiled. "You'll need the calories for your coffin," so I fed her an eviction instead.